Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening, and I send my love to all my amazing subscribers all over North America, Canada and the rest of the world. You guys are absolutely wonderful and you all rock. You're very special to me and I really appreciate all your encouragement. Let's get started. I've got an amazing story tonight that you're really going to love. And it comes from a lovely little town in Vermont, from a lady called Sandy, who really did believe that her uncle was a victim of a Bigfoot killing. She believes he had his head snapped. So let's get started. I think you're going to enjoy the story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sandy and I'm from a little town in Vermont, but I do not want to reveal all the details about my life, because I would like to remain anonymous for obvious reasons, especially because where I live, nothing ever stays secret for very long. Believe me, I know this from bitter experience, and there is nothing worse than gossiping townsfolk. I'm not keen on the idea of being a subject of their tall tales. Do not get me wrong, I love the townsfolk here, but idle gossip, well, it's a way of life here, and I just don't want to be a part of it. For all the doubters out there, it's highly likely that you're going to be cynical about my story. And I can't say that I blame you, really. In your shoes, I'd probably feel the same, because my story does sound implausible. But I want to assure you that my story is 100% true. And it all starts in 1982. Growing up as a child, I had often driven past the trailer park where there was a sign that said, "Real psychic readings available here from a proper gypsy." Carly had always mentioned how eager she was to go and see a psychic. Carly was my very best friend. So it was on her birthday that I decided to treat her by taking her to a psychic for a reading. It seemed to be a fun idea, but as long as the folks in the town didn't discover our dirty little secret. People in our town shunned the psychic that lived in the trailer park because they all said the practice of divination was both godless and evil. Yet I did have it on good authority that over many years, various town folks had been sneaking visits to see the psychic for a reading when they thought that nobody was looking. And most of those people were in fact churchgoers. The trailer park was situated at the back of the old loggers' road, and there were one or two trailers in a field that looked so old and shabby on the outside that I almost had the second thought about whether we should actually go into one of them. They really did look in desperate need of TLC and were in a state of disrepair. "Did anyone see us, Carly?" I asked, as we curiously sneaked up to the trailer. The last thing we needed was to be the centre of gossip in our town. "No, I think the coast is clear," whispered Carly. "I doubt anyone's seen us." I could see that Carly was looking so excited about the prospect of having her fortune told. As we approached the trailer door, we saw a dirty net curtain twitching, as if someone was having a good long look at us. An elderly lady ushered us in and invited us to sit on this threadbare red couch that looked like it had seen better days. The trailer smelt damp and musty, and we looked around the place curiously, noticing that everything was old, bedraggled, threadbare and shabby, as if the fortune teller herself was very down on her luck. The elderly lady pulled up a chair towards us. She really looked like a real gypsy because her grey curly hair was covered in purple beads, and she wore long dangling golden earrings and hundreds of bracelets on her aging hands that jangled every time she moved them. She was attired in a long red dress with a wraparound knitted poncho that looked almost as old as she was. "What is it you want to know?" she said in a deep husky voice. Anything really," said Carly excitedly. "A husband, maybe, in the future?" The woman closed her eyes and shook her head. No, I don't see any husband. No, you're not going to get married at all. There won't be any husband. But I do see lots of cats around you. You will have lots and lots of cats, and you will love them." Carly looked stunned. "No husband?" she said, looking aghast. "Are you sure about that?" The lady nodded. "But I hate cats," she protested. "I've always been a dog lover. I've never even owned a cat." The lady then turned her attention to me, and then she grabbed me very tightly and almost violently, and she looked at me through her milky white eyes. "Beware the hairy man," she said. "He's already taken one down, and you may very well be next." "What hairy man?" I asked. I thought she might be referring to my Uncle Bruno, because he was hairy. I didn't know anybody else that was hairy. The woman did not listen, but ushered us out as if she already had been exhausted by us. "Well, that was pretty useless," I said to Carly, feeling very deflated. "I'm so sorry. It really was a waste of time." The woman was barking mad. 2 weeks passed by, and I suddenly received a phone call from a solicitor in Tennessee, telling me that I was the sole beneficiary of my great-uncle Sam's property near Mount Pleasant in Tennessee. "How did he die?" I asked in surprise. I always got the impression that Uncle Sam was as fit as a fiddle and as strong as an ox. He was only 70 years old when he died, and he was robustly healthy, so that was strange. I had never met him before, but I had been told wonderful stories about him. And to think that he had left his worldly assets to me, that was extraordinary. I was touched to the quick. "Well, he was found with his neck broken. It was a terrible accident," said the solicitor. "I'm so sorry for your loss." As I put down the telephone, I could feel my heart fluttering with excitement. I'd never owned anything in my entire life, and now I was an owner of a property in Tennessee. It just didn't get better than that. The next day I decided to pack my bags and go out there as quickly as I could. I would stay on the land and finally make a decision about whether I should sell the place or not. When the taxi drove up the long dirt driveway to my uncle's log cabin, I was amazed how remote the place was and how vast the land. I was the owner of all this, I thought. I could hardly believe it. The sun was setting in a beautiful orange, yellow, mauve and pink tone, and I could hear the sounds of crickets and frogs. It was so gloriously serene here, with the rolling green, lush green countryside and the ubiquitous trees of every single kind imaginable scattered liberally around the land, young and old, small and large. It was just so glorious here. The cabin itself was large and spacious, made from 100-year-old timber, and it was a quality home that really needed a modern makeover, because judging by the 1970s decor, it was stuck in a time warp. I suddenly remembered that Uncle Sam's wife Maggie had died in the late 1970s, which might explain the outdated furniture, because nothing had been done to the place since then. Uncle Sam had been an outdoorsy person that spent most of his time outdoors, and he was a great tracker, a phenomenal hunter, and an amazing fisherman. All the trappings of his outdoorsy life were strewn around the living room, and clearly apparent. Even his large rifle collection was in a state of disarray, which was surprising for Uncle Sam because he was remarkably meticulous about his rifle. I noticed that all his bullets lay scattered out of their containers all over the floor, as if Uncle Sam had been in a hurry to fill his rifle with pellets. There were binoculars on the settee and a book on eagles and their nesting habits on a side table, along with a book of habits of primates. How odd, I thought. Uncle Sam interested in monkeys? They're not exactly native to North America. There was a notelet on a piece of bright pink paper with the word Sasquatch written on it, followed by a huge question mark. I did not have a clue what that meant. I found the remains of poor Uncle Sam's last meal on a plate in the living room, with the evident stains of evaporated coffee still left in the mug. How sad, I thought. I wonder how he snapped his neck. The following day I was up at the crack of dawn to the sounds of birds tweeting. It was a magnificent day, and as fall was approaching, the leaves were suddenly changing colour. So they were red, green, gold, and mauve, and they made the valley look even more enchanting and magical. I could see in between the trees dozens of white-tailed deers looking at me. I loved the way they twitched their beautiful white tails, and to look at their gentle and serene expressions was just so lovely. I decided to walk around the valley and take in as much scenery as I could. It was so gloriously beautiful here, but the place was too big for me, I decided. I knew I needed to renovate the cabin and put in some modern touches in order to get the best place of the property. Fast forward a couple of months, and the renovations to the cabin had begun and were going exceedingly well, but something was happening every single night that set my nerves on edge. I would hear terrible screams coming from the forest that sounded like a woman being murdered. I would also hear whooping sounds that I could not identify, and owl hoots, and so many of those owl hoots that you could be forgiven for believing there was an owl parked on every single tree. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it in my gut. And there were occasions during the day when I ate my sandwiches on that wooden deck that I had the distinct feeling that unseen eyes were watching me, and it creeped me out. One night I was woken up to these loud banging noises all around my property, on the trees and on the cabin itself. It sounded like someone was deliberately pounding a piece of timber and making a very big deal about it. When I ventured outside, I could see nothing, but I detected this awful sulphur-like odour that made me violently throw up. Something or someone was trying to scare me, and I had seen a dark shadow slipping into the forest, so I was convinced that it was a trick of the light, but now I was sure it was somebody. Whoever this intruder was on my land, he was trying to deliberately scare me. Maybe he was the one making the screaming noises at night and the owl calls, and maybe he was the one that was banging the door like an angry madman. I now felt angry about being subject to such harassment and abuse, and I was determined that come what may, I would drive this intruder off my land, and even call the police if it came to that. I imagined that this man was living on my land in a makeshift tent, and the next morning I ventured deep in the forest to see if I could find it. I took one of my uncle's high-powered rifles that was not something I was practiced or skilled at using. In fact, to be honest with you, I've never used a rifle in my life. But I needed to look the part, even if it meant bluffing the intruder. Surely I would come across as intimidating. I boldly walked through the forest with a dogged determination to get this guy off my land. I could smell him everywhere. The place smelt rancid and horrible. That nasty sulphurous odour was everywhere. So I knew I was getting close, and I could feel his steely eyes on me. I also began to wonder if he might be an insane sort of person, someone who could have escaped from a mental asylum, or a deranged killer of some kind. I just felt this sense of a menacing presence, and I knew that I wasn't imagining it. It sounds weird, but my instincts were telling me that I was in danger, so that was when I decided to call the police. "Yes, sir," I said. "Yes, that's the address. No, I've not seen him, but he is here, and I think he's highly dangerous. Yes, I'm in the forest on the left-hand side of the valley. Get here as soon as you can." Suddenly I saw a movement, and I raised my rifle as quickly as I could. "Come out," I shouted. "The game's up. You're trespassing on private land, and the police are on their way." Suddenly I heard the thunderous sound of a heavy rustle, and I could hear twigs being snapped and golden oak leaves being crunched under feet. This man, whoever he was a hefty weight, and he sounded like a rhino in a thicket. Then I saw him, but this was no man. Standing before me was a fearsome bipedal humanoid predator-like being, more terrifying and intimidating than any monster movie I have ever seen in my life. No, surely this was my wild imagination. This ghastly creature could not be real. I pinched myself to make sure I was not dreaming, and I was horrified to realize that this creature of 8 foot tall, 600 pounds, red-brown hair, was as real as you and I. The creature had a bullet-shaped head, a long, weathered, humanistic primate-like face, but it was the look in those hostile brown eyes that had my heart racing at 100 miles an hour. I could sense that this thing despised the very sight of me, and I'm certain, in fact, I'm not certain, I know he wanted me dead. Every sense in my body heightened me to this revelation. I had no experience in using a rifle, but I trembled so much with fear, I just knew that I would probably be better off if I didn't use it at all. Why was I not running away? I did not know the answer to that question. I could feel that I had soaked my pants, I'm embarrassed to admit. But I seemed absolutely unable to move a muscle. I just stood there in stunned stupor, staring in horror at this creature, as if I was waiting for my inevitable demise that was so clearly on the cards. There was no doubt about that in my mind. What was I waiting for, I wondered? The creature roared at me like a great big lion, but the sound was so much more terrifying that it made me disorientated and dizzy. The sound went through my body, causing it to vibrate, and my head began to throb violently. The creature seemed to be enjoying my terror, and he was toying with me as if he wanted to have fun with his dinner before finally consuming it. The creature lunged towards me in a mock charge. Then he pounded his chest violently in a show of dominance, and then he picked me up and threw me over his shoulders as if I was a sack of oranges. I started to scream at the top of my lungs, and I kicked my legs violently, but he held me with a firm grip in his huge hairy hands. Suddenly I heard the sound of distant shooting, getting closer and closer to the forest. The creature suddenly stood still for a second, as if deciding what on earth he should do. He then slung me on the ground, where I luckily landed on a huge pile of fallen oak leaves that cushioned the blow. The hairy thing then bolted through the forest like a bulldozer, and then he was gone. All was quiet for a moment, and the police arrived, checking to see that I was all right. I told them that a hairy man had bolted off into the woods, and they did try to run after him, but he had vanished. The officer commented on how huge the man must have been, because they had seen muddy footprints at the edge of the forest that were 16 inches big. That was no human, said the other officer. That was a bear with feet 16 inches big. I said nothing. I just told them a hobo with a lot of red-brown hair had been living in the woods and scaring me half to death, and they accepted my story. I was not about to tell them about this monster-like being, because I knew that they would never believe me. I wasted no time in selling my uncle's property. I did not want to hang around the place knowing that the creature could be around, because if he came back for me another time, I would be unlikely to escape with my life. Suddenly I remember my visit from the psychic and her warning about the hairy man who had already killed someone else. Suddenly I could make sense of my uncle's death. It had clearly been no accident. No wonder unused bullet shells were falling out of their packages in a haphazardous mess all over the floor. Maybe he'd been in a rush to load his rifle as the predator ventured closer to him near the time of his untimely demise. I imagine the creature just snapped his neck with one whack of his monstrous hands. I remember the book on primates my uncle had been reading, and the note with the word Sasquatch on it. Later I was to learn that Sasquatch, or Bigfoot, are another name for the hairy man. My uncle clearly had seen this creature, which would explain the research he had been doing. I'm in no doubt he feared for his life and was being hounded by the creature. Bear in mind, those days we did not have access to the World Wide Web, the internet or Facebook, so people in that time would never have known what this thing was. I also did not until the day when our technology changed and advanced, and information about unusual creatures became much more accessible. On the subject of my best friend Carly, to date, she has never ever married. One day she rescued a kitten from drowning in a heavy rainstorm, and she was so smitten by the little thing that she started rescuing other cats. When I go and see her in our house, she's literally surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of cats. You would think that the place would stink, but it doesn't, because she looks after those cats as if they were her children. In Vermont, they call her the crazy cat lady, so the psychic was right about her too. So there you are. That's my story. I want to just say that that was the most phenomenal story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.